The night Ida Quinn was offered to 3 different men before the supper dishes had even gone cold was the night she decided that the town of Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, had seen the absolute last of her patience. It was the autumn of 1874, and the frontier town of Harrow Creek sat like a crooked nail hammered halfway into the red desert earth, stubborn, unfinished, and sharp enough to draw blood if you were not careful where you stepped. The main street was nothing more than packed dirt and horse dung baked hard by the sun, lined with a general store, a livery, a doctor's office that doubled as a barber shop on Thursdays, and a saloon that never seemed to sleep. Beyond the town's ragged edges, the mesa country stretched out in every direction, vast and indifferent and breathtaking in the way that only wild things could be. Ida Quinn was 22 years old, with dark auburn hair the color of creek mud after a good rain, and eyes the precise shade of sage green that made men say foolish things when they looked at her too long. She had come to Harrow Creek 6 months prior, following her father, Edmund Quinn, who had borrowed money from the wrong people back in Missouri, and decided that putting 1,000 miles between himself and his debts was the most reasonable solution a man could come to. Edmund Quinn was not a bad man. He was simply weak in the particular ways that destroy everything soft around them, like termites in the walls of a fine house. Edmund ran a small freighting operation out of Harrow Creek, which meant he owned 2 wagons and a team of horses and owed favors to half the merchants in town. Ida kept his books, cooked his meals, mended his shirts, and tried very hard not to think about the life she had imagined for herself back when she was 16, and the world had still seemed arrangeable. She had no suitor she had chosen. She had no close friends yet in this place. What she had was a father who drank more than was good for him, a small room above the freight office that let in the wind through a crack in the eastern wall, and a stubbornness that the women of Missouri had once called unbecoming, but that the desert had made into something closer to armor. The evening everything changed began ordinarily enough. Edmund Quinn had invited 3 men to supper. He did not tell Ida why until she had already set the table and brought out the roasted pork she had been slow cooking since midday, and by then the men were already seated and grinning at her in the particular way that made the hair on the back of her neck rise like a dog who smells something wrong on the wind. The first man was Gerald Holt, who owned the largest cattle operation within 40 miles of Harrow Creek. He was 51 years old, thick through the middle, with hands like ham hocks and a way of looking at things as though he was calculating their worth at market. His first wife had died 3 years ago, and he had gone through 2 housekeepers since then, both of whom had left under circumstances the town whispered about but nobody could prove. He sat at the head of the table as though he had already been given the deed to the place, and when Ida set the platter down in front of him, he reached out and patted her hand without being invited. The second man was Preston Alcott, the owner of the general store, who was 44 and had never married, a fact he wore with neither pride nor shame, but simply as one wears a hat that does not quite fit. Preston was thin and pale, and had the look of a man who had spent his entire life behind a counter and intended to keep doing so. He was not cruel exactly. He was something worse, indifferent. He watched Ida the way he watched his inventory, with a calculating eye that was looking for usefulness rather than anything resembling feeling. The third man was a cattle drover named Buck Sable, who was 38 and came through Harrow Creek twice a year with drives from Texas. Buck was not unattractive, in the rough-hewn way of men who had spent decades in the sun and wind. He had a loud laugh and told stories about himself in the third person, which Ida found immediately insufferable. He had been married twice and had children scattered between 2 states that he rarely saw, which he mentioned with the breezy indifference of a man who did not understand why that information might not recommend him. Edmund Quinn waited until the pork had been served and the cornbread passed around before he cleared his throat and delivered the news that would rearrange Ida's entire world. "I have come to an arrangement," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Ida set down her fork. What kind of arrangement, Father? Edmund took a long drink of his whiskey. The three men at the table watched her with the patient interest of men who had already made up their minds and were waiting for the formalities to conclude. I owe a debt, he said. A significant one. Mr. Holt here has agreed to cover it, as have Mr. Alcott and Mr. Sable in their own portions, and in exchange, one of them takes you as a wife. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, like a stone dropped into a deep well, and you keep waiting for the sound of the splash, but it never comes. I see, Ida said, and she did see. She saw it with a terrible clarity, her father's weak hands around his whiskey glass, the three men watching her as though she were a horse being presented for inspection, the candle light making everyone's face look hollowed out and orange like jack-o'-lanterns in a row. She saw that she had been the collateral all along, that the supper, the slow-cooked pork, the careful table setting, all of it had been a stage dressed for a transaction she had not consented to and had not been told about. Which one? She asked because she could not think of anything else to say yet, and her voice came out very steady, which surprised her. Well, Edmund said with the terrible cheerfulness of a man who has convinced himself this is good news, that is up to you in a manner of speaking. Gerald has offered the most, so he has first choice. Then Preston, then Buck. Gerald Holt leaned forward. It is a fine arrangement, Miss Quinn. You would want for nothing on my ranch. I run a clean house, and I am not an unreasonable man. Preston Alcott nodded along as though Gerald had just read from Scripture. I would offer you a comfortable life as well, he said, more to the table than to her. Steady, predictable. Buck Sable grinned at her from the end of the table with his white teeth and his sunburned forehead. And I would show you a good time while I am in town, he said, and then laughed at his own implication. Ida stood up from the table. All four men looked at her. Excuse me, she said, and walked out through the front door. The night air outside was cool and smelled of wood smoke and horse and the faint sweetness of the desert sage. And Ida stood on the narrow porch of the freight office and pressed her hands flat against the wooden railing and breathed through her nose and counted to 10, and then started again because 10 was not nearly enough. She was not going to cry. She had decided that at some point in the last 60 seconds, and she held to it the way you hold to a fence post in a flood. She would not give any of those men, not even her father, the satisfaction of her tears. What she would do, she was not yet sure. She had no money of her own, not in any useful quantity. She had a small amount saved in a tin beneath her mattress, barely enough to get her to Santa Fe. She had no family elsewhere. She had no plan. What she had was herself, and she had always found that to be a complicated enough resource. She heard the door open behind her and she turned, expecting her father. It was not her father. The man who stepped out onto the porch was someone she had seen around Harrow Creek but never spoken to directly. A lean, quiet figure who had the kind of stillness about him that comes not from idleness but from discipline. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried several days of stubble. His eyes were a deep, particular brown, the color of good coffee held up to a window. He wore a plain canvas shirt and dusty trail trousers and worn boots that told you he had covered a great deal of ground in them. His name was Cyrus Whitaker, and he was the man who drove freight for her father on the longer routes, the ones Edmund's own drinking made him unreliable for. Cyrus had apparently been in the back room of the freight office all evening, having returned from a 2-week run to Las Cruces just that afternoon, and had heard the whole of the supper conversation while cleaning his harness at the workbench near the window that looked into the dining room. He came and stood beside her at the railing, not close enough to be improper, and looked out at the dark street where 2 horses stood tied at the saloon's hitching post across the way, their tails switching in the evening breeze. I heard, he said. I know, she said. A long pause settled between them, and it was not uncomfortable the way silences with strangers usually are. It had the particular quality of a silence between 2 people who understand the same thing without needing to say it. "What will you do?" he asked. "I have not decided," she said. "Something." Cyrus turned and looked at her then, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was too new and too fragile to be named, yet but was there nonetheless, like the first green thing pushing up through cracked desert soil. "What if I offered you a third option?" he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You are not going to put a price on me too, are you, Mr. Whitaker?" "No," he said, and something about the way he said it straightforward and without flinching made her believe him completely. "I am going to offer you a fair deal, and you can take it or leave it, and I will think no less of you either way. I earn good wages on these runs, and I have been saving. I will pay your father's debt in full, not in exchange for you, but as a settlement so the obligation is cleared. Then I am asking you, freely and as your own person, whether you would consider being courted, properly, on your own terms and at your own pace." Ida Quinn stared at this man, this quiet driver who had apparently spent 2 weeks in the desert thinking about harness leather, and had come home to find a woman being traded over a pork supper. "Why?" she asked. And Cyrus Whitaker was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because I have watched you keep your father's books and manage his business for 6 months, and I have seen you be fair and steady and capable, and I think you deserve better than being bartered. And because I would very much like to know you better, if you would allow it." It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. "You understand," she said carefully, "that what you are describing is very unusual. Most things worth doing are," he said. She looked back out at the dark street. A coyote called somewhere out beyond the edge of town, its voice rising and dropping in that lonely particular way. The horses at the hitching post shifted. "You said you would pay my father's debt," she said. "The full amount." "Yes. And you expect nothing in return." "I expect the chance to court you honestly. What you decide after that is your own affair. And if I decide the answer is no, then the debt is still paid," he said, "and you are free to do as you please." Ida was quiet for a long time. Inside, she could hear the low rumble of her father's voice and the 3 men talking among themselves, apparently in the process of negotiating which one of them was going to be offered the pleasure of her company, as though she were not standing 20 feet away in the night air making a decision of her own. "All right, Mr. Whitaker," she said at last, "but I want to be the one who tells them." The corner of his mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "I expected nothing less." She walked back inside with her spine straight and her chin level, and Cyrus came in behind her and stood near the doorway with his arms crossed and his face very still. And Edmund Quinn looked up from his whiskey with the bleary confusion of a man who has already decided how the evening is going to go and does not understand why something seems to have changed. Gerald Holt was in the middle of a sentence about his ranch house when Ida came to stand at the center of the table and looked at all 4 of them in turn. "I want everyone to listen carefully," she said, and her voice was level and clean as a good blade, "because I am going to say this once." The room went quiet. "I am not a debt to be settled," she said. "I am not livestock to be bartered or auctioned or offered. I am a woman with my own mind, and I have not consented to any arrangement that was discussed at this table tonight." She looked at her father. "I am disappointed in you, father, deeply. We will speak about that privately." She looked at the 3 men in turn, Gerald with his calculating eyes, Preston with his inventory stare, Buck with his grin fading. "Gentlemen, I thank you for the insult you have paid me this evening. I will be sure to remember it." Buck started to say something but thought better of it when he caught the look on her face. "Mr. Cyrus Whitaker," Ida said, and turned to where he stood near the doorway, "will be settling my father's debt in full, and that debt is done. There are no conditions attached to that settlement as far as I am concerned, and no arrangements to be made. Good evening to you all." Gerald Holt pushed back his chair and got to his feet with the affronted dignity of a man who is not accustomed to being told no by anyone, let alone a woman. "Now see here. Good evening, Mr. Holt," Ida said again, with such finality that even Gerald, who owned 1,200 head of cattle and had not been told no in recent memory, sat back down. Edmund Quinn stared at his daughter with an expression that moved through several stages: embarrassment, indignation, shame, before settling on the quiet devastation of a man who has just seen himself clearly and does not like what he sees. Preston Alcott excused himself first, collecting his hat with the quiet dignity of a man retreating from a business negotiation that has not gone his way. Buck Sable followed, casting one last look at Ida that was somewhere between admiration and relief, as though he had been spared something he had not fully thought through. Gerald Holt left last, heavily, without speaking. When they were gone, Ida and her father looked at each other across the cleared table and the cooling remnants of the supper she had cooked, and there was so much to be said between them that neither of them could find where to begin. Cyrus Whitaker excused himself quietly and went back to the workroom to give them their privacy, and Ida always thought afterward that this told her a great deal about the quality of the man. The conversation with her father that night was not a comfortable one, but it was an honest one, and those two things are sometimes the same. Edmund Quinn, stripped of his whiskey armor and his borrowed confidence, was simply a frightened, diminished man who had run out of good ideas and had made a terrible one in their place. He wept. Ida let him. She did not soften the truth or spare him its full weight, because she thought he needed to carry it a while, but neither did she say anything cruel. By the time it was over, something old and tattered between them had been cleared away like brush from a field, and what was underneath was small and tender and possibly, given time and care, capable of growing into something better. She did not forgive him that night. Forgiveness, she thought, was going to take considerably longer. But she left the door open for it. Harrow Creek in the weeks that followed those events arranged itself around what had happened the way small towns always do, absorbing scandal and gossip and slowly, over time, turning it into legend. People talked. Of course they talked. The story of Edmund Quinn offering his daughter over a pork supper, and the quiet freight driver who had stepped in and paid the debt, was exactly the kind of story that gets retold in general stores and over back fences, and across the bars of saloons, until it has been polished smooth as river stone. Most people's reaction fell somewhere between admiration for Ida and a kind of sideways respect for Cyrus that was mixed with uncertainty, because Harrow Creek was a place where women were generally expected to be grateful for the arrangements made for them, and Ida Quinn had conspicuously failed to demonstrate this quality. Gerald Holt was furious for about 2 weeks, and then redirected his energy into a dispute with a neighboring rancher about water rights, which was more in his line anyway. Preston Alcott went back to his counter and his inventory, and was, as he had always been, perfectly fine on his own. Buck Sable came through on a drive 3 weeks later, heard the story retold at the saloon, laughed his big laugh, shook his head, and said good for her with what appeared to be genuine feeling before riding on south. Edmund Quinn sold one of his wagons, paid down a portion of his debt to the men around town, and started coming home sober more nights than not all nights, not yet, but more than before, and Ida chose to count that as something. Cyrus Whitaker, true to his word, asked Ida nothing she had not already offered. What he did do was show up, not in the pushy, hovering way of men who consider their attentions a gift you ought to be grateful for. He showed up in the quiet, steady way of a man who has committed to something and intends to see it through. He was at work every morning by the time she came to open the freight office, and he was respectful and professional and did not press. But sometimes in the evenings, when the day's work was done, he would pause in the doorway of the office with his hat in his hand and ask if she might like to walk a little way up the road before the sun went down, or whether she had eaten, or whether he might sit with her on the porch a while. And she said yes more often than she had expected to. The first evening they walked together, they went up along the north road to where it curved around the base of the mesa, and you could see the whole of the desert spread out below in the last of the golden light. And they talked about Missouri and the places they had each come from and why they had come west, and Ida discovered that Cyrus had been born in Tennessee, had worked a farm until he was 17, had driven wagons across the continent twice in the service of various freight operations, and had come to Harrow Creek a little more than a year ago because a man he had respected had told him there was good work there. "And was there?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and then after a small pause, "and more than I had anticipated." She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the desert, not at her, and the side of his face in the last of the evening light was calm and even-featured, and she felt something warm and inconvenient stir somewhere near her sternum. She did not mention it. The second time they walked, it rained, an unusual, violent desert rain that came down in sheets without warning, the way desert rain does, all at once and committed, and they were caught on the road a half-mile from town with no cover. They ran, both of them, which she had not expected from him. She had built a picture in her mind of a man too reserved for something as undignified as running. But he ran, and she ran beside him, and by the time they made it back under the overhang of the livery, they were both completely soaked and breathless, and Cyrus Whitaker laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh properly, not the polite chuckle she had heard before, but an actual, full laugh, surprised out of him by the cold rain and the absurdity of two soaked people panting in a stable doorway. It completely rearranged his face. Ida found herself laughing too, and for a moment they stood there in the warm smell of hay and horse and the drumming of rain on the stable roof, laughing, and Ida thought, "There it is. There is the thing I was waiting to see." The third time they walked, she reached out and took his hand. She did it without drama, without announcement, without making anything of it, just extended her hand and slipped it through the crook of his arm as they walked, as though this were something they had always done. She felt him go very still for just a moment, and then settle, and they walked on that way through the long blue dusk of the desert evening without either of them saying a word about it, and Ida thought that this was perhaps the most right she had felt about anything in a very long time. Cyrus Whitaker had come from nothing, which was a fact he was neither ashamed of nor dramatic about. He had worked since he was old enough to be useful, which in Tennessee in the 1850s meant being useful very young indeed. He had 3 years of formal schooling, and had spent the rest of his education in the practical ways, reading whatever came to hand, listening carefully to people who knew more than he did, and paying attention to the world in the particular patient way that is its own kind of intelligence. He had never been a man of many words, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned early that most things he observed were better held close for a while before being let out into the open. He had seen enough of the world by the time he was 20 to know that men who spoke too quickly and too loudly rarely said anything worth hearing, and men who promised easily rarely intended to keep anything. He had noticed Ida Quinn the second week after she arrived in Harrow Creek. He noticed the way she kept her father's books with a precision that was evident even from across the office. He noticed that she was not afraid to correct the numbers when they were wrong, even when Edmund bristled. He noticed that she was patient with the men who came to arrange freight, patient in the way of someone who respects other people's intelligence, but will not pretend that an unreasonable request is reasonable just to keep the peace. He had told himself, sensibly and firmly, that it was none of his affair. He had continued telling himself this right up until the evening he had come home from Las Cruces and heard 3 men discussing which of them was going to take her, as though she were a parcel being sorted at the postal office, and something in him had gone very quiet and very decided, in the way of a man who has been deliberating something for a long time and has finally reached the end of his deliberation. He was not a wealthy man, but he had saved carefully over 2 years, and the amount Edmund Quinn owed could be managed if he was willing to part with most of what he had set aside. He had been willing. The question of whether Ida would want anything to do with him after the fact was something he had not known, and he had tried very hard not to want her to, because Wanting things had always seemed to him like a way of making yourself into a hostage to fortune. But standing on that porch in the dark with her, he had found he could not be entirely indifferent. Now, 6 weeks into the slow and careful business of making himself known to her, he was finding that indifference was altogether out of the question. She was the most interesting person he had encountered in a long time. She had opinions on everything and delivered them with a directness that he found bracing rather than alarming. She was funny in a dry, precise way that caught you off guard. She could be quiet without filling the quiet with noise, which Cyrus considered one of the rare and undervalued gifts. She was patient with people she liked, and had an extremely limited patience with people she did not, which she managed with such controlled good manners that you almost did not notice it until you thought back on the conversation later. She was also, he noted with the same careful objectivity he tried to apply to everything, beautiful in a way that he suspected she was not fully aware of, which made it worse rather than better. It was on a Sunday afternoon in late October that he kissed her, for the first time and entirely by accident, in the sense that he had not planned it for that specific Sunday afternoon, though he had thought about it in the abstract for some weeks. They had ridden out together to look at a water source he had been thinking about for the freight operation, a spring-fed pool about 4 miles north of town, where he had the idea of building a rest stop for teams on the longer routes. He had shown her the place, which was a small miracle of green and blue amid all the red and brown of the desert, ringed with cottonwood trees that had gone yellow and trembling with the season, their leaves dropping in slow spirals into the dark water of the pool. Ida had gone very still when she saw it. She had stood at the edge of the water with her hands at her sides and looked at the cottonwoods and the way the light came through their shaking yellow leaves, and her face had that look it sometimes got open, unguarded, something underneath the armor showing through. He came and stood beside her. "It is beautiful," she said, quietly, as though she did not want to disturb it. "Yes," he said. And then she turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and they were standing close in the way people stand when they have been walking side by side for some time and have gradually stopped noticing the distance between them. And for a moment everything was very still, the leaves, the water, the dry desert air, and he leaned in and kissed her gently, and she kissed him back. It lasted only a moment, and when they drew back from each other, the yellow leaves were still falling, and the water was still dark, and everything was exactly as it had been before, except that something had been established between them that had no going back from. Ida looked at him with an expression that was impossible to fully read, but that contained, he thought, something considerably warmer than neutrality. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Yes, I believe you are courting me quite effectively." The corner of his mouth moved. "I am doing my best." She turned back to the water, and after a moment he felt her hand find his, and they stood there like that while the cottonwood leaves came down around them and the desert light turned the whole world the color of honey. The business of courtship in Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1874, was conducted under a certain amount of public scrutiny, because small frontier towns have few enough diversions that a genuine romance becomes a source of communal investment, whether the people involved desire it or not. Ida was aware of this, and handled it with the brisk good humor she applied to most inconveniences. Cyrus was less comfortable with it but endured it, because the alternative was seeing less of Ida, which was not an alternative. Mabel Stritch, who ran the boarding house on the south end of town, and was generally acknowledged as the primary clearinghouse of Harrow Creek's social intelligence, approached Ida one afternoon in the general store, and delivered herself of the opinion that Cyrus Whitaker was a fine man, a reliable man, and that Ida could do considerably worse, with a sideways look that clearly referenced the 3 men at the supper table, which everyone in town had heard about in more or less accurate detail by this point. "I am aware," Ida said pleasantly, and Mabel looked satisfied and went away to share her observations elsewhere. The freight operation was doing better. Edmund Quinn, whether from shame or sobriety or some combination of the two, had been showing up sober and on time for the past month, and Cyrus's route management had brought in 2 new contracts from merchants in the next county over, and the books that Ida kept showed something approaching actual solvency for the first time since she had arrived in Harrow Creek. Edmund watched his daughter work and said nothing, but there was a quality in his silence that was different from before, less the silence of a man avoiding something and more the silence of a man listening. One evening in November, when the wind had turned cold and the mesquite fires were going in every hearth in town, Edmund Quinn came to where Ida was reading by the stove and sat down across from her and cleared his throat and said, with the stiff formality of a man delivering himself of something he has rehearsed for several days, "I owe you an apology that I should have made sooner." Ida looked up from her book. "Not for the debt," he said. "I mean for that too, but more for the thinking of you as something I could use, for thinking of you that way at all." The fire crackled between them. "I know that no words I say will undo it," he went on, his hands pressed flat on his thighs, "and I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. I am asking you to know that I understand it was wrong, that I understand what I risked and what I almost lost." Ida looked at her father for a long moment. He was 60 years old and looked older, and there were lines in his face put there by whiskey and by weather and by the slow grinding work of a life that had not gone the way he had once imagined. She thought about the man he had been when she was small, the man who had read to her from the Bible not because he was devout but because he loved the sound of the language, and who had once carried her on his shoulders through a summer fair in Missouri and bought her a sugar candy and told her she could be anything. "I know you understand it, Father," she said, "and I am not going to pretend the wound is not there, but I am also not going to keep carrying it as though I have nothing else to carry." He nodded, and his eyes were bright, and neither of them said anything more about it, but something was mended that night, imperfectly and carefully, in the way that things mended after being badly broken have a roughness at the seams forever after but are whole. She told Cyrus about it the next evening, when they were sitting on the porch of the freight office in their coats, watching the stars come out over the desert. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Lighter," she said, and also very hungry, because I forgot to eat supper while I was being emotionally significant." He laughed and she laughed, and he got up and went and found bread and dried beef and 2 tin cups of coffee, and they sat together on the cold porch and ate in the dark, and looked at the extraordinary number of stars that you can see in the desert sky in November in 1874, when there are no electric lights anywhere for 100 miles. And Ida thought that this, right here, exactly this was what contentment felt like. She had not felt it often enough to recognize it immediately. But she knew it now. The winter came to Harrow Creek in December with a seriousness that surprised people who had not spent a winter in the high desert before. The temperatures dropped with the ferocity peculiar to the territory, and the wind came raking off the mesa at night with a cold that had real intention in it. The wagon routes became harder. Cyrus came home from a run to Albuquerque in a storm that had turned the road to mud and ice, his horses white with frost and his own coat stiff, and Ida met him at the stable door with a lantern and a look on her face that told him, without any words at all, that she had been worried. He stepped down from the wagon and she handed him the lantern, and he stood there, cold and tired and covered in road dust, and she looked up at him and said, "You are back." "I am back," he agreed. "Good," she said, in a tone that tried very hard to sound merely practical and succeeded only partially. And he looked at her in the lamplight and felt something so full and certain that it was almost uncomfortable in its completeness. They stood their horses together and brushed them down in the warm barn, and it was the most domestic thing they had done side by side in the lamplight, the horses shifting and blowing, the smell of hay and leather, the cold outside and the warmth in, and by the time they had finished and pulled the barn door closed against the wind, something had shifted again between them, quietly and irrevocably. He had been thinking about the question of marriage for several weeks. He had thought about it practically, whether he was in a position to offer her a good life, whether his savings and wages could cover a proper start, whether it was too soon. He had thought about it emotionally, which was less comfortable for him but which he had made himself do, sitting with the feeling rather than turning away from it. He had thought about what it would mean to ask, and what it would mean if she said no, and had decided, with the clear-eyed honesty that was the organizing principle of his character, that the risk was worth it. He did not do it that night. She was tired and he was tired, and the wind was making the shutters rattle against every wall in the freight office, and it was not the moment. He did it 3 days later, on a cold, clear morning when the desert was white with frost, and the sky was the particular hard blue that comes after a freeze, and the world looked like something new. He asked her to walk with him before breakfast, and she came out in her coat and her breath made clouds in the cold air, and they walked up the north road to the mesa curve, where they had walked that first evening, and stood where you could see the desert spread out below. He turned to face her and he said, with the directness that was the only way he knew how to say important things, "Ida, I would like to ask you to marry me, not because of the debt or the arrangements or anything that happened that first evening. I want to ask you because I think you are remarkable, and because I love you, and because I want to build something with you. A real life, a good one, on terms that are fair to both of us. I am not a wealthy man, but I am honest and I work hard, and I will never treat you as less than what you are." Ida Quinn stood in the cold, clear morning with the frost-white desert all around her, and the hard blue sky above, and looked at this man who had stepped in not because he was asked, but because he thought it was right, who had given her a choice when she had been given none, who had been patient and present and honest with her every single day since. She had known for some weeks that she loved him. She had acknowledged it to herself with the same precision she applied to everything, noted it carefully, turned it over, examined it from multiple angles, and concluded that it was thorough and genuine and not going away. "Yes," she said. Cyrus was very still for a moment, as though he needed to be sure he had heard correctly. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said again, and smiled at him, and it was one of those rare full smiles that she kept close and did not give away easily, and it hit him somewhere in the chest with the force of something he did not have a word for. He stepped forward and took her hands in his, her cold hands in his cold hands in the January morning, and looked at her for a long moment with everything he had been keeping carefully contained, and then he pulled her in and held her, and she leaned against him, and they stood there in the cold desert morning while the frost slowly melted off the sage, and the sun came up behind the mesa. "I should tell you," she said, muffled slightly against his coat, "that I intend to keep the books for whatever we build together, and I will not be argued with about the numbers." "I would not dream of arguing with you about the numbers," he said. "Good," she said. "I should also tell you that I love you." He held her a little tighter. "I know," he said. "I have suspected it for a while." She pulled back to look at him. "How long?" "Since the rain," he said. "When you laughed." She considered this. "You are very observant, Mr. Whitaker." "It is a professional habit," he said. She laughed and he smiled, and the desert stretched out golden and silent all around them, and the new year was only 2 weeks old, and already it was better than any year she could remember. They were married in March of 1875, in the small church on Harrow Creek's only paved block, paved being a generous word for the gravel and packed clay surface the town had laid down the previous spring with great civic pride. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Alcott, who was no relation to Preston, and who had a booming voice that carried well over the noise of the wind through the church's ill-fitted windows. Ida wore a dress that Mabel Stritch helped her make, a sensible blue wool that nevertheless had enough care in the stitching to be beautiful, and she carried a spray of dried winter flowers because there were no fresh ones to be had in March in the high desert. Cyrus wore his only good coat, which Ida had mended at the left elbow so neatly you could only see it if you looked for it. Edmund Quinn gave his daughter away with a solemnity that was at once inadequate to what he owed her and more than he had managed in some time, and his eyes were wet before they had gotten halfway through the ceremony, and Ida held his arm steadily and did not look away. Half of Harrow Creek attended. Mabel Stritch cried. The sheriff, a laconic man named Breed who had never been heard to express an emotion in public, shook Cyrus's hand afterward with both of his and said, "Well done," with a gravity that suggested he meant several things by it. Preston Alcott came to the reception, which was held in the freight office with the furniture pushed back, and was courteous and appropriate and wished them both well with what seemed to be genuine feeling, and Ida thought the better of him for it. Gerald Holt did not come, but sent a note that was correct in form if cool in spirit, and Ida filed it in the stove. They did not have a great deal. They had the rooms above the freight office, which were Ida's, and which she had been slowly making more livable over the preceding months, mending the crack in the eastern wall, putting up curtains in the windows, bringing order to the shelves of books and ledgers, and the small collection of things she had accumulated that made a place feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Cyrus moved the last of his things from his lodging at Mabel's boarding house into the freight office rooms on the morning of their wedding, carrying his possessions in a kit bag and a trunk. And the freight office rooms, which had always felt temporary, began for the first time to feel like somewhere someone intended to stay. The first months of their marriage had the quality of something being carefully and thoughtfully built, not dramatic, not tumultuous, but steady and warm and deepening by degrees. They worked together during the days, managing the freight operation with the combination of Cyrus's root knowledge and Ida's business precision that made them, between them, considerably more effective than either had been alone. In the evenings they ate together and talked about the day and about larger things, the territory's politics, the newspapers that came on the stagecoach a week after printing but were still full of news from the wider world. Cyrus had never had a home, not truly, not since Tennessee. He had lived in boarding houses and tents and wagon beds for the better part of a decade, and the experience of having a place that was his and a person who was his, and who was also choosing, every day to be there, was something that continued to surprise him with its reality, the way a persistent gift does when you are not accustomed to gifts. Ida had not expected marriage to feel like this. She had expected the formal arrangement of it, the managed proximity, the performance of domestic contentment that she had watched other women perform. What she had instead was a companion, someone who asked her what she thought and then listened to the answer, who brought her coffee in the morning without being asked and left it at exactly the right distance from her ledger so it would not be knocked over, who sat across from her in the evening and read his own book without needing to fill every silence with conversation, and who, when she was tired or discouraged, did not minimize it or redirect it but simply sat with her in it until it passed. It was not perfect, nothing is. He was sometimes so deep in his own thoughts that he forgot to tell her things she needed to know for the business, and she was sometimes so committed to a particular plan of action that she did not hear the counterargument until she had already argued herself around to it from the inside, which was frustrating for them both. They had their first real argument in May over a contract he had agreed to without consulting her first, and it was a thorough and pointed argument, and afterward they sat on opposite sides of the room for an hour in a silence that had weather in it, and then Cyrus said, "You were right," in a voice that was not comfortable with the words but was saying them anyway, and Ida said, "I know, but I could have listened better," and the weather left the silence and they went on. She was with child by early summer. She knew before she was certain, felt it in herself with the instinct of a person who pays close attention to her own body. And when the certainty was established, she told Cyrus on an evening in late June, sitting at the kitchen table with the supper dishes still between them, with the directness that was her way. He was quiet for a moment that she read correctly as not hesitation but the particular silence of a man in the grip of something too large for immediate expression, and then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it carefully, as though it contained something precious. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Very." He was quiet a little longer, and then he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "I did not know I wanted this until this moment." "And now?" she asked. "And now," he said, "I cannot imagine anything I want more." The summer of 1875 was hot and long, and Ida found pregnancy in the desert in July to be an experience that tested her considerable capacity for endurance. And she managed it with the same brisk determination she brought to everything difficult, complaining about it precisely when it warranted complaint, and getting on with the work when it did not. Cyrus modified the freight route so he was home more often, and Edmund Quinn, who had continued sober and was showing signs of becoming a different version of himself, began shouldering more of the business management than he had in a long time. In October, when the heat had broken and the desert was cooling back to its most beautiful, the baby came. It was a boy. They named him Thomas Edmund Whitaker, Thomas for a man Cyrus had respected in his early freighting years, and Edmund for a grandfather who was working, imperfectly and honestly, toward being worthy of it. Thomas was born with very dark hair, like his father's, and Ida's green eyes, and an expression of focused consideration that was so entirely both of theirs at once that Mabel Stritch, coming to see the baby the following morning, declared that it was positively eerie and meant clearly that the child was going to be exceptional. Ida held her son in the October morning light and felt something she had no word for, something vast and quiet and absolute, a reordering of everything, a love so thorough it remade the interior landscape in an afternoon. Cyrus sat beside her on the bed and looked at the baby and at his wife and said nothing for a long while, and when he did speak, it was only to say, softly, "Thank you," which she understood to mean a great many things. Edmund Quinn came the next morning and stood at the door of the room with his hat in his hands, and looked at his daughter and his grandson with an expression of such naked emotion that Ida said, "Come and sit down, father." And he came and sat, and held the baby with the careful, astonished hands of a man rediscovering something he had thought lost, and wept without any apparent embarrassment. And Thomas slept through the whole thing with the serene indifference of the very new. The freight operation grew in the way that good things built on solid foundations tend to grow, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily and with accumulating strength. By the spring of 1876, Cyrus and Ida had added a third wagon and 2 more drivers, and had contracts with merchants in 3 counties. Ida's bookkeeping had expanded into a system of such organized precision that the new drivers and handlers complained about it with the particular respect people give to things they find difficult but recognize as correct. Edmund Quinn had a more formal role in the business now, managing the local contracts while Cyrus handled the route operations. He was sober most days, not all days, not yet, because the habit of a lifetime does not dissolve in a year, but most days, and the days he was not, he came in the following morning with a quiet shame that was its own kind of accounting. Ida watched her father's slow improvement with the same patient attention she gave everything, neither rushing it nor dismissing it, holding space for the possibility of it with an open hand. Thomas, by his first birthday, had begun pulling himself upright on any piece of furniture he could reach and regarding the world from this new vertical vantage, with an air of personal satisfaction. He was an easy child in temperament, engaged, curious, quick to laugh. He was interested in everything, particularly horses, and would crane toward the stable yard from whatever position he was being carried in with an intensity that Cyrus found deeply amusing. "He is going to be a driver," Cyrus told Ida, watching the baby attempt to navigate the freight office floor with the focused determination of a very small explorer. "He is going to have all the options," Ida said from behind the ledger, "and he is going to decide for himself." "Yes," Cyrus agreed, "that too." The winter of 1876 brought news from the wider territory that troubled Harrow Creek, as it troubled all the frontier towns, news of conflicts to the north. of the ways in which the forces of settlement were continuing to press against, and through the lives of the peoples who had been in this land long before any European set foot on it. Cyrus had always been uncomfortable with the casual injustice of this, in the straightforward way of a man who does not separate his personal principles from his observations of the world. He had worked alongside Navajo men on freight routes in years past, had been treated with fairness by Apache traders at watering holes far out in the desert, and had a clear-eyed understanding that the stories told about these interactions by white men in saloons were missing most of their actual content. He said this to Ida one evening, haltingly, because it was not the kind of thing men were generally expected to discuss, and she looked at him over her mending with an expression of quiet recognition. "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about it too." "What do you think?" he asked. "I think," she said carefully, "that this land was not empty when we arrived. And I think that the way that is being ignored, the way people are choosing to ignore it, actively and for their own convenience, is a wrong that history will not remember kindly." He nodded. There was nothing convenient to say after that, and neither of them tried to say it. They sat with it, as they had learned to sit with the difficult things, steadily and without flinching, but without pretending they could fix what was larger than themselves, only that they could be honest about it and fair in the small sphere of their own lives. It was in the spring of 1877, when Thomas was a year and a half in the freight operation had its best quarter yet, that Harrow Creek received a new resident who would become, over time, a significant figure in Ida's world. Her name was Constance Frew, and she arrived on the stage from Santa Fe as a schoolteacher hired by the town's recently formed school board, a board that Edmund Quinn had, in what Ida considered a promising late-life development, volunteered to serve on. Constance was 30 and practical, and had strong opinions about the importance of reading, arithmetic, and the moral duty of communities to educate their children regardless of their family's means, all of which she delivered with a calm directness that immediately reminded Ida of herself and made her feel a strong instinctive warmth toward the woman. Constance Frew and Ida Quinn became friends with the efficient speed of two people who have a great deal in common and the intelligence to recognize it, and within 3 months they had the kind of friendship that can sustain disagreement without damage and silence without awkwardness, which is the only kind worth having. Constance had observations about Cyrus Whitaker that she delivered to Ida with the objectivity of someone who has no personal stake in the matter. "He watches you," Constance said, one afternoon, while they were walking together along the North Road, Thomas toddling ahead of them on his determined little legs. "I am aware," Ida said. "He watches you the way people watch things they consider valuable," Constance said. "Like the way you watch the books." Ida looked at her. "I mean it as a compliment," Constance said. "I know," Ida said, "it is one." In the autumn of 1877, Ida discovered she was with child again, and this time the knowing settled over her more gently, less the vertigo of the first time, more the recognition of something familiar and welcome. She told Cyrus in the same manner as the first time, across the supper table, with directness and without preamble, and he received the news with the same quality of moved stillness, and reached across the table and took her hand and said, "How do you feel?" "Wonderful," she said, and meant it. Thomas, at age 2, was informed of his impending sibling by his mother with the simple factual honesty she applied to all things, and processed this information over several days before announcing, with the confidence of a child who has made up his mind, that the baby's name was Horse. "We will consider it," Cyrus told him gravely, and Ida had to leave the room. The baby arrived in April of 1878 in the earliest green of the desert spring, and was a girl. They named her Clara Marie Whitaker Clara because Ida had always liked the sound of it, and Marie for Cyrus's mother, who had died when he was 11, and whom he spoke of rarely, but with the particular careful tenderness reserved for memories that are precious because they are few. Clara was born with Ida's coloring, the auburn hair, the green eyes, the precise expression of a person who is already forming opinions, and Cyrus's constitution, which was to say robust and unflappable. She cried briefly, established that the world existed and she was in it and had thoughts about this, and went asleep. Thomas regarded his sister with the cautious interest of a small person confronting an unknown entity, and then looked up at his father and said, "Not horse." "No," Cyrus agreed. "Not horse." "Clara," Thomas said, with the resigned acceptance of a child who has been overruled but intends to note his objection for the record. Edmund Quinn met his granddaughter with the same wrecked joy with which he had met Thomas, and this time Ida sat beside him and held his hand while he held the baby, and they were quiet together, and it was a different kind of quiet from the ones they had shared before, easier and warmer, and carrying within it the sense of something healed if not fully mended, and going forward. The summer of 1878 was a good one. The freight operation was the most successful business in Harrow Creek by this point, with 5 wagons and a reputation that had spread across 4 counties. Cyrus had taken on a trusted senior driver named Walter Hobbs, a steady man of 45 who managed the Texas routes with the same quiet competence Cyrus had once brought to them, which freed Cyrus to stay closer to home and take on the management work that the operation's growth had made necessary. Ida ran the books and the contracts with a rigor that had made them the most financially stable small freight operation in the territory, and she did it while raising 2 children and running a household with the organized energy of a person for whom efficiency is a form of love. They had built a proper house by this point, not grand, but solid, on the west edge of town, where the sunsets came straight through the front windows, and painted everything in the early evenings in shades of copper and gold. Cyrus had built most of it himself, in the evenings and on Sundays over the preceding year, with help from Walter Hobbs and from Edmund Quinn, who had turned out to be a better carpenter than anyone had suspected, including himself. The house had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen, and a front room, and a wide porch where you could sit in the evening and see a good distance in 3 directions. Ida had planted the porch with climbing roses that were, 2 years in, beginning to make their case for the property with considerable enthusiasm. Thomas had his own small room, which he had furnished, with great seriousness, with a collection of horse figurines that he had acquired over his 3 years of life through a combination of gifts, trades, and determined acquisition. Clara slept in the main bedroom still, in the cradle that Cyrus had built with a precision that Ida found privately extraordinary, running her hands over the smooth wood joints and thinking about the care in the making of it. On an evening in late August, when the children were asleep and the heat had broken, and the desert was quiet in the particular way it gets after the day's wind settles, they sat together on the porch, side by side in the chairs that Cyrus had made to match, and Ida had her feet up on the railing and was reading a novel that Constance Frew had lent her, and Cyrus was reading a survey report about road conditions in the Northern Territory, which was not a novel but was apparently just as absorbing. And the lamp on the porch table threw a warm circle of light around them, and the roses breathed their late summer smell into the cooling air. Cyrus set down his survey report at some point and looked at his wife, who was absorbed in her novel with the focused contentment of someone doing exactly what they want to be doing, and thought about the night on the porch of the freight office 4 years ago, when she had come out into the dark and pressed her hands against the railing and breathed through her nose, and had the whole of her life offered to 3 men she had not chosen. He thought about how different everything would be now, in any of those 3 directions. How different she would be, how different he would be. "What?" she said, not looking up from the novel. "Nothing," he said. She turned a page. "You are looking at me." "I am." She looked up now over the top of the book with the particular expression that said she was waiting for him to say the actual thing. "I was thinking about gratitude," he said, "about how difficult it is to adequately express it." She looked at him for a moment with her green eyes in the lamplight, and her expression moved through something that was not quite readable but that contained, he thought, everything that needed to be there. "You express it very well," she said, "in the ways that matter." He looked at her, she looked at him. The desert was quiet around them, and the lamp was warm, and the roses were in their last summer bloom, and somewhere inside the house, a child shifted in its sleep with the small, certain sounds of a person safe and dreaming. "I love you," he said simply. She set the book down on her knee. "I know," she said. "I love you too." And then, in the tone of a woman who is always going to be Ida Quinn regardless of how much she loves you, "And now I would very much like to find out how this chapter ends." He smiled and picked up his survey report, and they read on together in the warm circle of lamplight. And the night settled over Harrow Creek, New Mexico territory, with the particular softness of a night when everything is well and accounted for and in its right place. The years that followed wove themselves into the fabric of the town and the territory with the steadiness of lives well lived. The freight operation continued to grow, adding routes and drivers, and eventually a formal partnership agreement that Ida drew up herself with the precision of a legal document, covering all contingencies and written in language so clear that Cyrus said it was like having an argument with a very logical ghost, because there was no way around any of it. Edmund Quinn, in the winter of 1879, gave up drinking entirely. Not ceremonially, not dramatically, but quietly and finally, in the way that decisions made after long struggle tend to be made, without fanfare and without asking for credit. He told Ida about it on a January morning over coffee in her kitchen, with Thomas on his knee and Clara pulling herself upright on the table leg, and she looked at her father and nodded and said, "Good," in a tone that contained years of hope and grief and finally, something cleaner. He lived with the steadiness of a reformed man for the remaining years of his life, which were more than a decade, and he spent them being as present and useful as he had not been in the years before. And if it was not enough to fully account for everything, it was something real, and Ida received it as such. Thomas grew with the swift urgency of children on the frontier, where life demands early competence. By the time he was 5, he could ride competently. By 7, he was helping in the stable with a thoroughness that suggested Cyrus had been right about his disposition. He was his mother's child in the precision of his thinking and his father's child in the patience of his temperament. And he was the most popular child in Constance Frew's one-room schoolhouse, partly for his personality, and partly because his mother's contributions to the school's books and supplies meant that the classroom had considerably more resources than most frontier schools could claim. Clara, who had entered the world with opinions and continued to develop them at a rate that Ida found both exhausting and deeply satisfying, was reading before Thomas had managed it, which Thomas received with the equanimity of a child who has decided that competition is not his preferred mode, and Clara had not yet decided anything of the sort. In the summer of 1880, when Ida was 28 and Cyrus was 34, Harrow Creek held its first proper 4th of July celebration, complete with a band brought in from Santa Fe, a roast that lasted 12 hours, and enough noise to satisfy the most demanding requirements of festivity. Ida wore a dress she had made herself from a deep green fabric she had ordered on impulse from the catalog, and Cyrus, watching her come down the porch steps toward where he was waiting with Thomas on his shoulders, thought for the 100th time that she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen, and for the 100th time had the same quality of quiet certainty that nothing in his life before her had quite prepared him for the particular way she had remade everything. They danced together that evening, on the packed earth square in the center of town where the band had set up, with the torches burning and the stars overhead, and the desert breathing cool in the dark beyond the edges of the firelight. Ida was a good dancer, which she had not told him before the first time he asked her to dance, almost a year into their marriage, with a modesty that was so out of character for her in every other respect that he had found it irrationally charming. She moved well with him, because they had learned each other's rhythms in all the ways that matter, and he held her in the proper way, and they moved through the music together, while Thomas was passed between Edmund Quinn and Mabel Stritch, both of whom were far more interested in the baby Clara at the moment, and had the look of people who have been waiting all year for the opportunity to hold her in a festive setting. Constance Frew danced with Walter Hobbs, which Ida watched with quiet approval and said nothing about, because Constance had expressly told her to say nothing about it. But there was a warmth in Ida's silence on the subject that said everything she was not saying. They danced until the band played its last tune, and the torches burned down, and Harrow Creek settled into the particular piece of a town that has celebrated something and is satisfied. And Ida and Cyrus walked home with their children through the warm dark, Thomas asleep against Cyrus's shoulder and Clara in Ida's arms. And the stars came down low over the desert the way they do on August nights in New Mexico when the air is clear and the world is very still. They put the children to bed and stood together in the quiet kitchen for a moment before bed, and Ida leaned against the counter and looked at her husband in the dim light of the single lamp. "Do you remember that first evening?" she asked. He knew which evening she meant. "Yes, I have been thinking about it today," she said, "about how differently it might have gone. I do not let myself think about that too often," he said honestly. "It is not a comfortable thought." "No," she agreed, "but I think sometimes it is worth it to know the distance you have traveled." She was quiet a moment, looking at the lamp. "I want you to know that I am grateful. Not only for the practical thing you did, though I am grateful for that too, but for the way you did it, for giving me the choice." Cyrus was quiet in the way he was quiet with important things. "You did not need to give me the choice," she said. "You could have made any number of calculations that would have justified not bothering or not in the way you did, but you saw a person in a bad situation and you thought about what that person actually needed rather than what would serve your own convenience." She looked at him directly. "That is not common, Cyrus." He looked back at her steadily. "It was not a difficult calculation," he said. "For you," she said. "For me," he agreed. She crossed the kitchen to him and he put his arms around her and she rested her forehead against his collarbone, and they stood in the lamplight kitchen in the house they had built while their children slept in the next room and the 4th of July settled into quiet around them. "I love you very much," she said into his shirt. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I know," he said very softly. "I love you too." The years continue to be kind to them in the way that years are kind when they are built on something solid. Not without their hardships, not without the ordinary wear of life in a territory that was still becoming itself, but steady and warm and full of the particular richness of a life, shared between two people who have chosen each other in all the meaningful ways. Constance Frew did, eventually, marry Walter Hobbs in the spring of 1881, and Ida was her matron of honor with a fullness of heart that she expressed, characteristically, not through tears at the ceremony, but through the extraordinary thoroughness with which she had organized the reception, right down to the arrangement of chairs and the precise schedule of events, which Constance received with the affectionate exasperation of a woman who knows exactly who her best friend is and loves her for it without reservation. Edmund Quinn died in the winter of 1889 at the age of 75. Which was a respectable age for a man who had spent the first half of his adult life attempting to destroy his own health, and the second half making his amends. He died in his sleep, in the room above the freight office that had become his again after Ida and Cyrus moved to the house, on a night when the wind was coming off the mesa in great cold gusts that rattled everything in the town. Ida sat with him the following morning and held his still hands, and told him the things she had told him before and a few new things she had found at the last moment. And she wept genuinely and thoroughly, without performing anything. And then she dried her eyes and went and told the children that their grandfather was gone, which Thomas received with the serious gravity of a 13-year-old boy, and Clara received with the particular fierce grief of a child who has loved something wholeheartedly. Cyrus sat with Ida that evening and let her be exactly as she was, sad and grateful and complicated in the way grief is when someone you love has also hurt you in ways that were never completely resolved, only enough. He did not try to simplify it. He handed her a cup of tea and sat beside her and was present, which was what she needed and which he had always known was what she needed. He was trying to be better, she said. He was genuinely trying. Yes, Cyrus said. I think that counts for something. It counts for a great deal, he said. She nodded and drank her tea and looked at the fire and eventually leaned her head against his shoulder. And he put his arm around her and they sat together in the old companionable quiet that had always been between them. The quiet of two people so thoroughly known to each other that no silence requires filling. The freight operation was, by 1890, the most significant business concern in Harrow Creek and one of the more substantial ones in the surrounding county. It had 12 wagons now, and relationships with merchants and ranchers and government contractors across the territory, and an office that had expanded to include 2 clerks and a route manager. And Ida's bookkeeping system had been adopted, with her permission and her husband's pride, by 2 other freight operations in Santa Fe who had heard about it through the merchant network. Thomas, at 15, had the run of the stables and a natural authority with the horses that made the hired hands take him seriously, without him having to insist on it. He was going to take over some portion of the operation. Everyone could see it, not because it was required of him, but because it was what he wanted, which was the difference that mattered to his parents. Clara, at 12, was the most formidably well-read person in Constance Hobbs's schoolroom and had ambitions toward medicine or law, neither of which were easy paths for a woman in 1890, a fact which Ida acknowledged with full honesty and then said, with the precision and certainty that had always been the organizing principle of her character, "The world is changing, slowly and too slowly, and not without a great deal of effort from the people who want it to change. But it is changing, and what you are and what you know is never wasted." Clara received this, filed it, and continued developing opinions at her customary pace. The spring of 1891 brought new growth to the house's roses, which had by this point entirely colonized the porch railing and were making a serious bid for the south wall. Ida tended them with the particular attention she gave to things she loved, which was thorough and unsparing, and occasionally required Cyrus to hold the ladder, which he did without complaint. They were 45 and 39, and they had been together 16 years, and the shape of them together was as natural and settled as anything in the landscape, as particular as the way the mesa sat against the sky, as recognizable as the smell of wood smoke in the evening. He still watched her. Constance Hobbs had noticed it over many years and mentioned it once at a supper with the 4 of them, and Ida had said, "I know," and Cyrus had said nothing, and the look that passed between the 2 of them was the kind of look that makes other people feel briefly and pleasantly unnecessary. He still brought her coffee in the morning, at exactly the right distance from the ledger. She still told him the truth without softening it, and he still preferred it that way. They still walked together in the evenings sometimes, up the north road to the mesa curve, where you could see the whole of the desert and the sky above it, and stood where they had stood that first evening when she had taken his arm, and the cottonwoods had been yellow in the autumn light, and he had kissed her for the first time. The view from that curve was the same view it had always been, the desert vast and various and indifferent and beautiful, rolling away to the horizon in shades of red and gold and gray, and the sky above it enormous and clear, and the 2 of them small below it in the way all people are small below the sky, but present and solid and known. "Do you regret it?" he asked her once on one of those evenings when they were both past 40 and the children were older and the business was solid and the house was full. She looked at him with an expression of such complete and patient certainty that the question dissolved before she even answered it. "Every day," she said, "I think about what my life would be if you had not stepped out onto that porch. Every day I think about it because it makes me understand exactly what I have." She paused. "No, Cyrus, not for a single morning." He nodded and looked back out at the desert, and she leaned against his shoulder the way she had always leaned against his shoulder, and they stood there in the cooling evening while the light went down behind the mesa, and the first stars appeared, and Harrow Creek below them glowed with its lamp-hand fire light against the dark of the desert, a human thing made in the wild of the land, impermanent and stubborn and in its best moments. In the moments of children sleeping and tables set, and two people choosing each other again in the quiet dark, something very close to what it was trying to be. Thomas Whitaker turned 18 in the autumn of 1893 and formally joined the freight operation as a junior partner, signing the agreement that his mother had drawn up with her customary legal precision in the parlor of the house on the west end of town, while his father shook his hand with both of his and his grandmother Constance Hobbs, who had become grandmother in the emotional sense long before any formal designation, wiped her eyes in the corner. Thomas was, by every measure, a good man. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's intelligence and the particular additional quality that comes from being raised by two people who love each other well and honestly. A quality that is difficult to name but easy to recognize. A kind of rootedness. A confidence that is not arrogance but simply the settled certainty of a person who has always known exactly where they stand and with whom. He had, at 18, a girl he was courting with the same patient seriousness his father had brought to the same endeavor 3 decades earlier, and Ida watched this with the bittersweet fullness of a mother recognizing herself in someone else's story. Clara, at 15 and ferociously brilliant, had already written to 2 universities in the East inquiring about their policies regarding female students, and had received responses that were less encouraging than they should have been, which she received with the controlled fury of a young woman who has inherited her mother's capacity for patient outrage and fully intends to use it. "The world is too slow," Clara told her mother, with the particular impatience of someone for whom speed of intelligence makes the slowness of institutions feel like a personal affront. "Yes," Ida said, "it is. Keep pushing." On the last day of the autumn of 1893, when the desert had gone cold and the cottonwood trees along the North Road had shed their last leaves, and the sky was the hard, clean blue of a deep winter just beginning, Cyrus and Ida walked together up to the mesa curve as they had so many times before, and stood where they could see all of it, the town below, the freight operation visible even from here by the arrangement of its buildings and yards. The house on the west edge with its colonized porch roses cut back for the season, the schoolhouse, the church, the whole texture of a place that had been remade over 19 years by the living of lives inside it. Thomas was down there managing the afternoon routes. Clara was in school with Constance. Edmund Quinn's grave was on the East Hill where the winter sun hit first. Everything that had been unresolved was resolved. Everything that had been unknown was now known. The freight books were balanced. The house was solid. The children were thriving. The roses would come back in the spring. Cyrus put his arm around his wife and she leaned into him, and they looked at it all together in the clear, cold afternoon light. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "That night on the porch," he said, "when I came out and found you standing there, I did not have a plan. I had only just decided in the space of a few minutes what I wanted to do, and I was not at all certain you would hear it as anything other than another man telling you what to do." She was quiet, listening. "I was afraid," he said. "It is not something I have said before, but I was afraid that I had misread everything, that you would look at me with the same look you had given those 3 men, and I would deserve it because what was the difference? Just another man deciding what he thought was best for you. The difference," Ida said quietly, "was that you gave me the choice." "I know," he said, "but I did not know if you would see it that way." She turned to look at him, and he looked at her, and the desert light was the color of late autumn, golden and clear and a little melancholy, the way all beautiful light is melancholy because it is passing. "I saw it," she said. "I saw you. The moment you said it, I saw exactly who you were. And I thought, there is a man who understands what a person is worth. He was quiet with that, holding it the way he held the things that mattered. I have loved you, she said, since the rain. Since the night we ran from the rain and you laughed, she smiled. You have a good laugh, Cyrus. You should let it out more. He did laugh then, a real one, surprised by it and not minding, and she laughed with him. And the desert was wide and patient around them, and the sky went on forever above, and the world was full of the particular sweetness of winter coming and everything prepared for it and nothing missing. They walked back down together, arm in arm, in the late afternoon that was already going blue and cold, their boots finding the familiar road, the town lights coming on one by one against the gathering dark, the freight office, the school, the church, the saloon that had always been there and probably always would, the houses along the main street, and finally their own house on the west edge with its roses and its wide porch and its lamp lit already in the window. Because Thomas had come home ahead of them and lit the lamp against the dark. Ida Quinn Whitaker walked through her own front door with her husband at her back, and the smell of supper on the air. Thomas had put something on. Bless the boy. He had his mother's sense about what needed doing, and Clara's voice rising from the back room, reading something aloud with the emphasis of a person for whom words are serious business, and the lamp light on the walls of the home she had built in the desert at the edge of the world. And it was all of it, every inch and moment of it. Exactly what she had made it. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, and Cyrus came in behind her and hung his beside it, and Thomas appeared from the kitchen with flour on his hands and the confident air of someone who has a situation under control. "Stew," he said, by way of announcement. 40 minutes. "Good," Ida said, and squeezed his arm as she passed. Clara came in from the back room with her book and her opinions and her green eyes, and stopped when she saw both her parents, and looked at them the way children look at their parents sometimes when they catch them simply being, not doing anything in particular, not teaching or managing or correcting, just existing in the same space with the easy closeness of people who have chosen each other so many times it has become the natural state of the world. "What?" Clara said. "Nothing," her mother and father said, at almost exactly the same moment, in almost exactly the same tone, and looked at each other with the brief shared amusement of people who have become, over years and through everything, so deeply acquainted with each other that even their reflexes have learned to match. Clara went back to her book with the editorial sigh of a person surrounded by the inexplicably satisfied, and Thomas called from the kitchen that someone needed to slice the bread, and Cyrus went to slice the bread, and Ida sat at the kitchen table with the lamp warm on the wood grain, and Clara nearby with her book and the smell of the stew, and the sound of the wind coming off the mesa outside, where the desert was going dark and cold and vast, and the stars were beginning, one by one, to appear over Harrow Creek, New Mexico territory, on an evening in the winter of 1893. She had been offered to 3 men in one evening, a long time ago in this same town, at a table not far from this one, over a pork supper she had cooked herself. The 4th man had not been offered anything. He had simply stepped out onto a dark porch and spoken to her honestly and given her the one thing that had been withheld from her all evening, which was the choice. She had chosen. And every morning since, in the small and large ways that matter, in the coffee at the right distance from the ledger, in the laugh surprised out of him by rain, in the hands that had held her children first and held her steadily through everything since, he had made it right and she had made it right, and between them they had made something that no arrangement, no bartering, no transaction could ever have produced. They had made a life. A real one, on terms fair to both of them, in the wild and gorgeous country of the New Mexican territory, where the desert was always vast and the sky was always enormous and the stars, on a clear winter night, came down as close as promises kept.